earlier decisions that set the constitutional boundaries for when aid can go to religious institutions. First, there was the seminal school choice case, Zellman v. Simmons-Harris. That case held that it did not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment for a state to establish a school choice program, so long as the program was religiously neutral and one of true private choice. Second, there was Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia versus Comer. In that case, a church applied to receive a public benefit to renovate its playground, but it was denied solely because of Missouri's no-aid clause, again, a clause very similar to one in Kansas. The court reversed that ruling under the Free Exercise Clause, holding that the state could not deny a public benefit to a church solely based on its religious status. From these cases, the court fashions its decision in Espinoza. Zellman meant that school choice programs were permissible under the Establishment Clause if they were religiously neutral, and Trinity Lutheran meant that public benefits could not be denied on account of religious status under the Free Exercise Clause. Building on these rulings, the Espinoza court held that it was unconstitutional to interpret Montana's Blaine Amendment as preventing children attending religious schools from receiving scholarships based solely on religion. In Chief Justice Roberts' words, quote, "A state need not subsidize private education. Once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious." And that's where Kansas is. So after Espinoza, there can be no doubt that the Constitution prohibits a state from banning students from using a state scholarship program to attend religious schools. Accordingly, to the extent that Kansas's Blaine Amendment conflicts with Espinoza by disallowing religious schools to participate, it is constitutional. And this is applicable whether the legislature tries to enact a publicly funded voucher program, a tax credit scholarship program, an ESA program, or any other variation thereof. So if the legislators on this committee choose to enact a school choice program, they can rest assured that Article 6 of the Kansas State Constitution poses no obstacle to the program's constitutionality in light of Espinoza. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David, for your testimony. I'm going to now open it up for questions. Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So wasn't there another case out of Missouri? And maybe I just didn't hear that. So.
I'm sorry. I think you might be referring to the Trinity Lutheran case. That case was the one that was out of Missouri that I referenced in my testimony.
Okay. I don't have your testimony sitting here in front of me, and I just perhaps didn't hear that. So it's more than one case.
Yes.
Other questions? Representative Johnson.
Yes, Representative Johnson. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I am also working with homeschooled students in my area, and I'm curious, is these tax benefits, are they prohibited to a homeschool setting?
No, they're open to homeschool students. I don't have the legislation in front of me, but they're essentially open to any student that I believe is entering Kansas school for the first time, to homeschool students, and to other qualifying students.
Excellent, thank you.
Other questions? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to follow up on Representative Johnson's question. So for clarity, if there was a homeschool student that wanted to take advantage of this, would they have to attend a school, or would these funds be able to go for materials and like online classes and such?
Yes, I mean, typically the way that these programs are designed is that they set out a list of materials and of different ways that the funds can be used, and these funds can go to tutoring services, they can go to online classes, they can go to books and materials, they can go to tuition for schools, they can go to a whole range of different educational uses.
And just to follow up on that, if there was so it's been my experience when I have discussions with homeschoolers, and there are a lot of them in my district, that they want as little government interaction as possible. And so if we were to give them funds for materials and other things, do there have to be strings attached to that, like testing and things like that?
Well, I mean, this is up to the legislature to decide how to design it. You can go with a light touch or with a heavy touch. Typically, most of these bills have some sort of regulation that relates to accountability. So like nationally normed standards. Also like ensuring that the funds are going to the things that they're supposed to be paying for, that they can't be used for fraud and so on. But it's really up to the legislature to decide how they want to do it. But it's also up to the parents to decide whether they want to participate in the program and take advantage of it with the strings that are attached to it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions online or in our committee room? David, I just have one follow-up question for you. Do you know of any other states that have had to take a step back from any policies since this Espinoza ruling, or any specific application since the Espinoza ruling?
Yeah, I mean, there have been different states that have engaged in challenges. Or really, I should step back and clarify and say that there was an ongoing lawsuit prior to Espinoza that has since been interpreted to limit its usage because it relates to the religious uses of tuition as opposed to the religious status. So basically, in the Espinoza decision, the justices made a distinction, and they said that the decision came down was based on the fact that Montana was discriminating based on the religious status of the students and of the schools, and that it wasn't, and that the case was not decided based on the religious uses to which the tuition money could go. A lot of people think that these are distinctions without a difference, and the cases that are currently going up, there's one in Maine called Carson, are working on fleshing out these questions.
Okay. Any further questions? Representative Tarwater? Representative Susan Estes.
Are there any pending cases that will likely succeed and change Espinoza on the horizon?
Well, the case that I just referenced, the Carson case, that's out of I believe the First Circuit in Maine, and again, that case is sort of it's basically modifying Espinoza. So that relates to the town tuition programs that they have in New England. Where essentially instead of going to a public school, students have the option of going to either a public school in a different area of the state, or they can go to a private school. And the way that Maine has essentially interpreted these rules has been to limit their application at certain religious schools, depending on, for lack of a better word, how religious they are. So essentially, if you have like a religious school where it has some sort of an historic affiliation, then they tend to allow the students to go to these schools. But if the school is more, let's say, vigorous in its religion, and it's more conservative and traditional, they disallow that. And that relates to the whole status use question that I was getting at before, where the state is essentially arguing that they're not being discriminated based on their religious status, meaning like who they are as a school. They're being discriminated. They're discriminating against on what they choose to use with the funds, meaning like religious worship or religious education or religious instruction. To a lot of people, these are, again, distinctions without a difference. Like, what does it mean to be religious but not do religious things? But these are questions that are currently being decided in the wake of Espinoza in other courts.
All right, Representative Hoffman has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. David, thank you for your testimony. So to boil it down, under the Kansas Constitution, because we give funds to any private schools, then that means that we can give it to religious private schools. Kind of basically the same thing as if a school building, if they're going to open up to any sort of a club, they have to open up to all clubs. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's it. That's exactly it. You can't, under Espinoza, you cannot exclude a religious school simply because it's religious.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Nguyen, she is online.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is along the same lines. Until there is a challenge, a court challenge of Kansas law, it is just your opinion. Wouldn't you agree it's just your opinion that everything is legal? But that if you actually don't know that for a fact until there is a legal challenge, correct?
Well, it's true that it can certainly go into court and the lower court could rule the other way, but it would go up on appeal and then on appeal again, and it would almost certainly be ruled in conjunction with Espinoza unless the U.S. Supreme Court itself rejected that or reversed itself.
Right, and we all know the process, but again, this is your opinion. I respect your opinion, but you don't know for a fact because Kansas law has never gone to court, correct?
This
To
particular
your
case,
knowledge. To
no,
your knowledge, right?
right, but even prior to Espinoza, Kansas courts, still had to follow the federal constitution, and under the Trinity Lutheran decision in 2017, the Kansas courts would still have been, bound by that, and presumably would have come out the same way.
Correct, and we understand the rules of the game. I'm just saying, have we ever litigated the current law? And of course, we haven't litigated the expanded law because we haven't passed it, correct?
Right.
Correct. Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Are there any other questions? Representative Landwehr.
Okay, Madam Chair, and I don't know if we've got a revisor or whomever can answer this, but I believe it's correct that Kansas has the Blaine Amendment.
I believe you're correct, and Nick is going to, our revisor, Nick Myers, is going to speak here briefly and talk about our Kansas Constitution.
Because I believe that, one of the many reasons that it has been struck down in these other cases has to do with some severe discrimination against a specific religion, which now just is the religion of our current president of the United States.
And I would also note that anytime the U.S. Constitution will always supersede the Kansas Constitution, just like a state law will always supersede a local ordinance. Yes, Representative Landwehr.
Well, and Madam Chair, you're correct on that, except with what the Kansas Supreme Court did on the abortion decision that they made, where they actually, and I believe it was the first time in our history, don't quote me on that they separated us from the federal Constitution, which means that even if the federal law of Roe v. Wade was ever overturned, Kansas would still be allowed to do abortions up to minutes just before delivery.
All right, thank you for that point. Before we turn it over to our revisor, we do have a few more questions. Representative Tarwater?
I was just wondering, David, do you know how many times has the Kansas Supreme Court gone to the Supreme Court and won?
I don't have that question in front of me, but the Kansas Supreme Court is bound by the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court that relate to the federal Constitution. So if the Kansas Supreme Court, even in interpreting its own Constitution, is in conflict with the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation of the federal Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court will prevail.
And I'm sure we can get that from our Attorney General, and you may be referencing a couple of cases that were overturned in the U.S. Supreme Court just in the less than a decade ago, maybe 5 years ago even.
So the reason I ask is every case that I know of that has gone to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, they have overturned the Kansas Supreme Court I don't know of any that haven't been overturned.
That's a great question. We can ask that of our revisers, and if they don't have that answer, maybe they can follow up and just give us some historical reference to that. Any further questions for Mr. Hodges? No further questions? Well, we really appreciate you coming, taking time out of your day to speak to our committee. Are there any final words, anything you'd like to share in closing?
Just that you can be assured that under the U.S. Constitution, that you can certainly pass the school choice program that I have reviewed. The Espinoza decision, makes that clear. It's here to stay. This was not a decision that came out of nowhere. It's a decision that builds off of many other decisions going back at least 20 years and really going back at least 50 years. So you can rest assured that if you pass this program, that it is not going to realistically come into conflict with Article 6 of your Constitution. Thank you.
Nick, we can't hear you, so if you're muted, unmute. We want to turn you free to address the committee. Okay, it says you're unmuted, but we cannot hear you.
Madam Chair, you speaking to me. This is Nick Myers with the Revisor's Office.
Yes,
I'm sorry, I lost audio there for a second. I didn't hear that transition there.
Yep, we are ready for you to respond to any of the questions that you may have heard, to David Hodges, Representative Tarwater's question regarding success with the Kansas, or success at the U.S. Supreme Court, and also specifically our Kansas Constitution, Article 6. Thank you.
Yeah, before I kind of get into a little brief of the Kansas Constitution, I wanted to speak to two things that might help the committee and just kind of clarify what David was talking about. The committee, as you are aware, Kansas currently does have a tax credit scholarship program on the books. And I believe that program was very similar to the program that Montana had, and the Montana Department of Education used their constitutional provision to deny funds to religious schools under that program. Under the Kansas program, the Kansas Department of Education has not taken that step. And actually the law in the tax credit scholarship program defines what a qualified school is. And a qualified school is any private accredited school in Kansas. And as you heard, there were references to a bill that's likely going to be coming in on this. So I'd be happy to try to clarify that, but I thought it might be a good piece of clarification about our program, the tax credit scholarship program, and the schools that it includes.
Okay, go ahead. And well, we're going to take a question here quick. Representative Landwehr.
So Nick, in their legislation, did they require accredited schools?
I'm not sure on that. When I looked at the case, and David could probably correct me, it looked like they started that program in the Department of Education, or Montana's Department of Education, made a rule saying that those funds under that program could not be used for religious institutions. And as I said, Kansas has not taken that step with the current tax credit scholarship program.
Right, Nick, if you want to go ahead and proceed and provide an overview.
Yeah, certainly. And to Representative Tarwater's question, I'll have to get back on that. I don't have that information on the top of my head. So I'll follow up with that. Committee, and I don't know if you've been provided the text of Article 6 of the Constitution of the State of Kansas. I'm just going to briefly kind of go over that text, kind of go through a quick history of how that got to where it is today, and go over some of the important provisions in that Article 6 of the Constitution of the State of Kansas. So as you are aware, Article 6 is the education article of the Kansas Constitution, and it assigns certain roles and duties to certain entities. These entities include the legislature, the Kansas Board of Education, or the Kansas State Board of Education, and locally elected boards of education, and also the Commissioner of Education. So just a brief little history from the beginning of Kansas statehood with the Wyandotte Constitution. Article 6 has always been the education article of the Kansas Constitution. Originally, back in 1861, when the education article was first drafted, it was really designed to provide for the establishment of schools during pioneer times. And there were 9 sections in that article for that purpose. After World War II, enthusiasm started to grow to modernize the state's educational system and became kind of a prominent focus of the legislature. And during the legislative session of 1965, the legislature directed the Kansas Legislative Council, which is like the LCC, to study the education article of the Constitution and any needed amendments that were necessary to rebuild the legal foundation of the educational system in Kansas. So in 1966, the Kansas Legislative Council submitted its report and recommendations. They suggested that Article 6 be rewritten to what they said, establish a framework capable of providing a modern educational system, possibly for the next 100 years. So after getting that report, their legislature approved a constitutional amendment during the 1966 session, adopting those changes. And that amendment was then voted on by the people and ratified by the people of Kansas on November 8th of 1966. The provisions of Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution have not been amended or changed since that 1966 constitutional amendment. Getting into the specific provisions, Article 6, Section 1 of the Kansas Constitution, what it states is that the legislature shall provide for intellectual, educational, vocational, and scientific improvement by establishing and maintaining public schools, educational institutions, and related activities. Article 6, Section 2. This establishes the State Board of Education and the State Board of Regents, but for our purposes, I'll mainly stick to the K-12 portions of the Constitution. And what this provision says is that the legislature shall provide for a State Board of Education, and which shall have general supervision of public schools. That term general supervision kind of grants some self-executing powers there to the State Board of Education. Article 6, Section 3 establishes some criteria for how to vote for and how many persons will be elected to the State Board of Education. Article 6, Section 4 establishes that the State Board of Education shall appoint a Commissioner of Education. And then Article 6, Section 5 gives and establishes local public schools under the general supervision of the State Board of Education shall be maintained, developed, and operated by locally elected boards. So that section establishes locally elected boards under that general supervision of the State Board of Education. And then finally, Article 6, Section 6, the finance piece. The main focus here, especially recently with the Gannon litigation, has been on Article 6, Section 6B. And what this provision states is that the legislature shall make suitable provision for finance of the educational interests of the state. As you know, in Gannon, that suitable provision language has been interpreted by the Kansas Supreme Court to mean that the school finance system has to be both adequate and equitable. And what the Supreme Court has said is that adequacy is determined and is looked at by looking at the structure and the implementation of the school finance formula and assessing whether it is reasonably calculated to have all Kansas public education students meet or exceed the Rose capacities. And then the equity component, the Supreme Court has said that school districts must have reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity through a similar tax effort. Also in that Article 6, Section 6 section, the part that David was talking about, Article 6, Section 6 C, that clause saying no religious sect or sects shall control any part of the public educational funds. And then Article 6, Section 7, the savings clause, I'm not going to get into that. I don't think there's been any discussion by the courts on that provision. But that kind of sums up very quickly Article 6, the education article of the Kansas Constitution. I know there's been, I've had some questions as to whether Article 6 in the Kansas Constitution provide or whether the courts have found a right to an education under the Kansas Constitution. The short answer to that is no. The courts have not found a individual right to an education. Back in 2005, one Supreme Court Justice, Justice Beyer, wrote a concurring opinion in the Montoy decisions dealing with school funding and school finance. And what Justice Beyer said is that she would have used it as an opportunity to find that the Kansas Constitution provides a right to an education. And what she said is that look at Article 1, or Article 6, Section 1 and Section 6. And those are evidence enough to show that education is a right, and it's a right, it should be a right under the Kansas Constitution. That, as I said, the short answer being no, that rationale didn't catch hold with the Montoy cases, and then in the Gannon litigation, no justice brought that issue up during the Gannon litigation. And that was quick, but I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that the committee has, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Nick, and I think there's always lots of questions. We will start with Representative Penn and then, Representative Penn first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nick, the quick question I have, religious schools, we heard in the last presentation that they have pretty much a carte blanche access to the amenities and the facilities for the state schools in the school setting. Are they also duty bound to abide by any ordinances or orders from the state through the school system for compliance or anything of that nature?
Not through the Constitution. I assume if the schools are accredited by the State Board of Education, they would have some duties under those accreditation, the accreditation criteria.
Okay, very well. And another quick question, Madam Chair, if I may. And thank you so much for that. When the court determined the adequate and equitable interpretations that you just brought up regarding the suitable provision mandate, was there any limit or guardrails to that?
Just those tests that I outlined. I mean, those tests that judging adequacy based upon whether kids are receiving the education to get the Rose capacities. that's kind of the guardrail we're at now. That's how the Supreme Court, the Kansas Supreme Court has said how to judge whether a school finance system is adequate, and same goes for the equity component. Are schools able to have a similar tax effort to get to the same kind of a reasonably similar education? Those are the tests that we have right now, and I would say, I guess those are where the guardrails are at right now.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. All right, we don't have further questions, but I'm going to ask you a question, Nick. If we look at the Constitution under the finance section, letter C, it says no religious sect or sect shall control any part of the public educational funds. Setting Espinoza aside, can you give us history about that particular segment of the finance section, when it was added, if it's always been there, and perhaps the intent behind it?
Yeah, certainly. I'm trying to remember if the Wyandotte Constitution had a similar provision to that, and I'll have to look to see if it's been in the Kansas Constitution since its inception. Of course, that's been there since 1966. And I believe there's been a little bit of litigation on it. Back in the 70s, there was a case about a scholarship program to some higher educational institutions, and whether it was valid to provide scholarships to students who were attending private post-secondary educational institutions under that provision, and the court said, yeah, it is. There hasn't been too much, I don't think, too much litigation on that provision specifically in Kansas. But I'll double check and see if it's been around since the inception of Article 6, and see what other litigation has been on that provision.
So Nick, would that phrase be the Blaine Amendment that we hear so much about?
Yeah, that's a Blaine Amendment type of provision right there. Yes.
Okay, and perhaps if you could just follow up with us and provide us a little information maybe next week on the Blaine Amendment in Kansas and how it may have been applied historically, I think that would be helpful.
Certainly.
Any further questions from our committee? Representative Tarwater.
I have a question for David Hodges, if he still can take it. Talking about the equity issues that we've had in the past in Kansas, would the bill that you reviewed, would it cause equity issues if, for example, there aren't any private schools in a certain area? Would that cause equity issues?
I'm sorry, to be perfectly frank with you, I feel that I can't offer an opinion on this, having not read your equity cases. But I would be, delighted to read more and get back to you.
About Nick, would you think that there would be equity issues based on what you know from the past cases?
Yeah, this is Nick Myers with the Revisor's Office again. So the test put out by the Supreme Court for equity is asking whether school districts have reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity through similar tax effort. So, of course, that's looking at school districts and their taxing effort. If taxing effort is changing with this, I could talk to you about an equity analysis, but I don't think some of these programs will necessarily change taxing efforts, or I'll have to look at them, but I'll keep thinking about it too.
All right, committee, if there are no further questions, either remotely or in our committee, do we have someone else? Representative Owsley.
Thank you. Nick, I'll be curious to see the data you find upon the constitutional amendment that the chair was speaking of, whether it was, but just to be clear, that was ratified by the people in 1966 as a vote.
Yes, the entirety of Article 6 was ratified at the November 8 election in 1966.
Okay. And then could you remind me what our current scholarship program is capped at?
I believe there's a $10 million cap that applies to that program that can be divvied out in tax credits, or that people can get tax credits for. So once that gets up to that $10 million of giving out tax credits, it would shut those credits off, and I can't remember if it prorates them or what. I'd have to look at that.
And it might be a question better fit for the Department of Ed, but do we know what utilization of that 10 million is currently being?
Yeah, Jared, we do have those numbers, and we have a report annually from KSDE, and you will be provided that if it's not already available next week. So,
Okay, perfect.
yes, but I think someone made it yeah, it's 2 to 2.5, and it's never gotten close to its maximum. So we have, the full report will tell you the number of students that have qualified, have used the program, what's the average cost for each student, and other information like that. So that will definitely make sure you have that.
I appreciate
Any other-
it. Oh, I'm sorry. When Dale was here and I was on education, I was up to speed on all that, but it's been just a minute. So the refreshment would be appreciated.
I appreciate the refreshment every session myself, so no apologies needed there. Any other questions? Well, committee, I appreciate your time checking in with our committee today. We do have a scheduled meeting tomorrow with a legislative post-audit, and that, of course, will be dependent on whether we are finished with floor. If we are not able to meet, or we cannot delay it, then I would just ask you to listen to, or for an announcement at the well for a short meeting tomorrow. It's legislative post-audit. Well, no, it's not the well, it's from the Legislative Post-Audit Committee reporting to us. Yes. So if there are no other comments from anyone, then I will adjourn the meeting. Have a great evening, K-12.